Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Hello, friend, and welcome back to Delingpole, the podcast brought to you by me, James Delingpole, courtesy of Breitbart and Podcast One. And as usual, I am totally excited about my guest this week. He's a man of many, many parts, and he's incredibly sound. His name is James Bartholomew. Welcome to the show, James.
Hi.
James, you've got a book to plug, Inter alia. So let's mention your book first. I think it's going to be of interest to a lot of readers, listeners rather. It is called The Welfare of Nations.
Correct.
Which is a sequel to your previous book, The Welfare State We're In. And I'm guessing, disgracefully, I have not read the book, but I'm guessing that the welfare state we're in was not generally positive in its view of welfare states.
The welfare state we're in argued that the British welfare state, in its modern form, that's to say since 1870, had done more harm than good. So I attempted nothing more than to make that case. But it did leave, when I gave talks about it, it did leave people with the question, so what would you do? And that's what the welfare of nations is partly aimed at answering.
Can I just rewind a moment? By setting yourself against the welfare state, lots of people are going to be thinking, not our listeners, obviously, because they're all pretty where we are, but I mean in the generality of the population, they would think that people like you are complete and utter bastards. Because how could you possibly be against something which has provided the poor with healthcare and education and all these things which would never be there without the kindly hand of government, would they?
That's right, and I remember the publisher of my previous book on a completely different subject, which has been very successful, when I told him what I wanted to write, he said, he screamed actually, he didn't say, he said, screamed down the phone, "You can't believe that." And it wasn't quite clear whether it was impossible that I should believe that, or whether it was not allowed that I should believe that.
Do you know, I had a worrying through when you said, I thought you were going to say something else. Anyway, but isn't it bizarre? I know myself, and I know that I do not want the poor to squirm in penury and misery and to die early, not particularly. And I imagine you're the same. You're not a particularly nasty bit of work. And yet, the way that the left caricatures people like us is uncaring, selfish. We're not, though, are we?
No. And I think my big change moment took place in Hong Kong in the early 1980s, when I had a friend who was very much a careful economist, and he said, in 10 years' time, the GDP per capita of this place will be bigger than that of Britain. And that, at the time, was just bizarre. And the reason was that it had very low tax, free trade, and with that low tax came because it had a very small welfare state. And what Hong Kong demonstrated to me was the power of capitalism to improve the lot of the poorest people. And when I lived in Japan, secretaries there were having holidays that middle-class professionals weren't getting in England. And the power of economic growth to raise the condition of the poorest people is tremendous. And of course that's without saying a whole lot of many other aspects of this, one of which of course is that the benefits that have been given to people because they are less well off than others have often, round the world, led to more people being unemployed. And if you want to look at the measures of unhappiness, the most guaranteed people to be unhappy are the unemployed. They're more likely to be alcoholics, they're more likely to smoke, they're more likely to die young, they're more likely to be hospitalised. Every measure you can get, mental illness is more common among the unemployed. It is the most devastating thing to do to a person, to make them unemployed. And that's what welfare states around the world have done.
Yeah, have you spent much time looking at the 19th century, which has been very successfully described by leftist historians as an era of where the rich got richer and the poor suffered greatly. They were exploited by mill owners and so on. We know the Dickensian version of the 19th century. I was wondering whether you have an alternative version of it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the welfare state we're in has a great deal on this. Education in the 19th century, before the state got involved, was growing at an astonishing rate. Between 1800 and 1850, let alone beyond that, the growth was fantastic. And in fact, the historian of that period of education said that state education jumped on a galloping horse. And there was a study done by the government in about, I think it was 1856 or so, to establish what percentage of children were educated for 6 years. And they found that 95% were. And for various statistical reasons, this was probably an underestimate. Illiteracy was growing terrifically. And of course, in terms of prosperity, children started that century in clogs and finished it in shoes. The improvement in living conditions was gigantic during the 19th century. It's a complete fantasy of the left. They don't actually put any numbers, because if they put the numbers, then it would expose the fallacy of what they're saying. But the idea, the narrative of school books, textbooks, is that, as you say, the dreadful conditions in mills and mines, and as if they were all living in a rural paradise before. They were not. They were literally starving to death. Starvation ended in the 19th century because of the economic advance that took place.
What about healthcare? Because again, I think we have this idea that before the NHS, people were going to hospital with prolapsed. Well, they couldn't go to hospital because there weren't any, apparently. Women were suffering prolapsed uteruses, and all manner of horrors were happening to people because the state was not there to provide them with healthcare. Is that the case?
Certainly not. I mean, every single leading teaching hospital in London existed before the NHS. It's one of the big expropriations of property that has ever taken place in Britain. There's the expropriation of the monasteries by Henry VIII, and then there's the expropriation of private and charitable hospitals by the NHS, and the expropriation of private schooling by state schooling, which was crowded out and killed off.
So, how did the bastards get away with this?
Because it sounds good. We're going to give you free education. We're going to give you free healthcare. So, I mean, in a way, I sometimes think that the people on the other side are almost childlike in their simplicity. The idea that just because something aims to do something, that's it. That's the end of the story. It doesn't matter whether it actually works or not. The idea is that, above all, that you should show that you care by showing you're in favour of what claims to be going to do something good for people.
I suppose what I'm wondering is, where were the James Delingpoles and the James Bartholomews of their day? Why was nobody advancing the case for private healthcare, for charity and so on, all the things that we know provided these services in the 19th century, in our greatest period of economic growth, let's not forget. How come the narrative was captured by the bad guys?
I think it's because it's easier to understand, but there were people who objected on the other side. There's that great woman philanthropist, was it Olive? I can't remember her name now, but she argued against a state pension in a Royal Commission hearings in front of actually Prince Edward, and it's in the welfare state we're in. And she said that a provision of a state pension would be damaging to the willingness and enthusiasm of people to save and provide for themselves. And argued this very, very passionately. So there are people here and there. And of course the doctors were against the NHS. They were overwhelmingly against the NHS and had many meetings arguing that it was a theft, and it would undermine the trust between a doctor and patient, because they would just become a government employee. Oh, no, they will not become mere government employees, they were told. They would maintain their independence. At that time, before the NHS, consultants gave their time in the voluntary hospitals, which I suppose we would call charitable hospitals. They gave their time for free, for nothing. There was no argument about a consultant's contract, because they weren't after money. They acted pro bono. and they made their money by private practice, either in the morning or the afternoon, and worked at the voluntary hospital in the other half of the day.
It's often said that conservatives have this understanding of the world that they recognise that man is flawed and that therefore you need structures in order to be able to encourage good behaviour. So you need, obviously, law and order and sort of legally enforced property rights and so on. But I think one of the things that the left sometimes misses about conservatives is that we actually have a very optimistic view of human behaviour as well, in that when people grow rich, we understand that actually they become more likely to spend their money philanthropically, and we have lots of historical evidence of this. And I don't understand how it is that the narrative has been so successfully captured by the left, whereas you say we had this massive expropriation of private property from hospitals, schools. What was the other one?
Monasteries. Which the monasteries actually, I mean, maybe you laugh, but actually the monasteries were providing welfare. The reason why the poor laws developed in the Elizabethan period, I think, is because Henry VIII expropriated the monasteries and shut down their welfare activities, which included looking after people who were down and outs, effectively, and also the very elderly.
Can we do a thought experiment for a moment? Imagine if you and I were Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. I leave it to you to decide which of us is going to have the top job. But I think we'd be a pretty good double act. If we were to fulfil our instincts and completely scrap the welfare state, what would happen?
Well, I mean, obviously you'd be able to reduce tax to 15%, and as a result,
10. Sorry to have an argument already about
we're going to fall out, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Do you think that why 15%?
I don't have any religious review of that matter, but that's what Hong Kong has had for many years, and was able to work with it. Well, I mean, I think what would happen, we would also have free trade, we would have enormous growth, we would have far less regulation. For the welfare of nations, I discovered a calculation made by some American academics of what would be the position of America now if it had not had increased any regulations since 1950. This is just on regulations, not on tax, but just on regulations. It reckoned that the GDP per capita of America would be 3 times what it is now. America would be 3 times richer. I mean, it's a staggering thought of what regulation has done. And this is one academic report, but it refers to other reports done by a different methodology, which apparently come to similar conclusions.
Yes, but the David Aronoviches of this world would say, that's just another sign that you're a heartless bastard. Because what you don't understand, James Bartholomew, is that these regulations are there to protect the interests of the workers. Because if they weren't told they can't climb up ladders except with specialist ladder training, they would fall off their ladders and break their necks, and their families would suffer. Things like that. People talk about workplace accidents and stuff, and they argue that these things are only prevented by the benign hand of the state. How do you reply to that?
Well, I mean, I think over and over again, what people who create regulations do not look at is the unintended consequences of those very regulations. For example, if you say to people, okay, all care homes for the elderly must be wide enough for a wheelchair to go into them, and they must have lifts to go up and down to enable those wheelchairs to get into the upper floors. Every single one must have that, by law. It ends up with the cost of that is so great for existing care homes that they end up having to close, and many of them have closed. And so you end up with people, not enough care home places, so you end up with people living at home who are not capable of living at home, falling over and dying at home in pain, not being discovered for some time afterwards. In fact, the increase in people in lone deaths is one of the scary things of modern civilization.
Yes, much evil is done in the name of social good, isn't it? There's another example. I discovered recently that Wales apparently has its own parliament, a comedy parliament called the Welsh Assembly. And the Welsh Assembly apparently passed this legislation whereby if you want to prescribe medicine in a care home, and we're talking about even things like paracetamol, you have to be a qualified nurse. Can you imagine trying to run a care home when you're trying to give Mrs. Jones her her paracetamol, and you've got to wait for a registered nurse to turn up.
Yes, it's dark.
Their system is so... I mean, my sister lives in Wales, and I once had the misfortune of having an accident in Wales. I was at a wedding, and I fell into a ha-ha while I was crossing the lawn. I was blinded by the spotlights illuminating the big house, and I fell 10 foot into a ditch and broke my ankle. And I had to go to Abergavenny Hospital to get treated. And this is a run-up, by the way, to the next section of the show, where we're going to talk about the NHS in more detail. But I remember going to Casualty, thank God I wasn't wearing fox hunting kit. I mean, imagine what that would have been like. You wouldn't want to break your leg fox hunting in Wales, would you? Or in England, actually. I went to Casualty, and I remember feeling, rather as you must when you go to collect the dole or something, I was being treated like a supplicant for a healthcare service that I had paid for, and really I was treated like scum, and I was a damn nuisance in their health. They wouldn't even give me any painkillers or anything. But this is where the welfare state has got to us. So in the next section of the show, I know you're going to have some sound things to say about this. We are going to talk about the National Health Service and Obamacare and the world beyond. You're listening to Delingpole with me, James Delingpole, and my special guest, James Bartholomew, brought to you by Breitbart and Podcast One.
The Forbes interview just hit, featuring the king of podcasting, Adam Carolla. And we just launched the Forbes Under 30 podcast, where we talk to young entrepreneurs, hosted by me, Steve Goldblum.
It's interesting because when you're a creator, that never leaves you. You always have this urge to want to create.
That's Martellus Bennett, the Super Bowl-bound tight end of the New England Patriots, our first guest. Tune in and hear more about all his creative endeavors. Subscribe to Forbes Under 30 on iTunes now, and be sure to give it a rating and a review.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to Delingpole, a podcast introduced by me, James Delingpole. Comes courtesy of Breitbart and Podcast One, with my very special guest, James Bartholomew, author of The Welfare State We're In and his exciting sequel, The Welfare of Nations. Is that right, James?
That's right, yeah.
And I've been itching for you to tell me about the National Health Service. Are you a fan of the NHS? Do you go all sort of rose tinted and dreamy when you see those three letters?
Certainly not. The Welfare of Nations is partly an international comparison, and of course I was comparing international healthcare systems, and I looked for all sorts of different indicators. It's well known, for example, that when it comes to cancer, the 5-year survival rates in Britain are among the worst in the world in the major cancers that kill people. And I looked at other measures too, and it's over and over again. Britain came out in the bottom section. It never came out in the top section. It is, I think, the worst healthcare system in the world. It is the reverse Carlsberg, and I'm talking about advanced countries. Yeah. And so I don't think there's any country in the advanced world which has a healthcare system as bad as that of Britain.
That can't be true, James, because whenever I read in the newspapers about the NHS, I read people talking gratefully about the treatment that their mother had or that they had, and they can't believe their luck in having had healthcare treatment in a hospital. It's just extraordinary. And some of them have actually been cured and not died, which is great. And I also read the phrase, the envy of the world. And whenever I hear politicians talking about it, not just Labour politicians, but Conservative politicians, I don't think I've ever heard a Conservative politician argue for the disbandment of the NHS. So where are we going wrong here?
I think that is beginning. I worked with an MP, Owen Paterson, on a paper looking into the quality of the NHS, which very clearly came to the conclusion that it is an inferior system and that we should look to radical reform. So that was the first MP that I know of, and a Tory MP, who said we need to change this system. And I think it's I've been looking at this for many, many years now, and I detect a change in atmosphere that's taken place. This phrase, the envy of the world, is still occasionally heard, but it's very rare now. It used to be commonplace 30 years ago. It is now rare. And that's because people know. They've seen one story after another about poor care. And then there was the staff scandal, which, where elderly people were not looked after properly. They weren't even fed properly. They were not
lying in blood and urine.
They died in hundreds because of poor care by the NHS. So I think that gradually people are getting more real about it. I think the genuflection that takes place in the BBC and among politicians is because they feel they have to say that, but actually it's like trade unions in the 1970s. People apparently give respect to it, but deep down they know it's wrong. They know it's not working.
Be honest though, if you were on Question Time or Any Questions and the NHS question came up, how comfortable would you feel about giving it both barrels?
Oh, absolutely.
You would?
I mean, I did once a programme for Radio 4, 45-minute programme, which I argued for the abolition of the NHS. And it was a phone-in, and the producers were astonished because a majority of those people who phoned in were supporting my point of view.
That is interesting. No, I answered that question. I'm genuinely puzzled because you know how pretty outspoken I am about most right-wing issues. But when the NHS comes along, I might hold some of my fire just because it is our national religion.
Can I recommend reading The Welfare of Nations?
Well,
and comprehensive arguments. And I mean, it is almost as if there was no counterfactual, as if it was the NHS or nothing.
That's true.
And one of the other little things is the people who are well travelled, who've been to Australia, to Scandinavia, to Italy, seem to think that when it comes to healthcare, all those countries disappear, and there are only two countries left in the world, Britain and America. We have the choice between British NHS and cruel, rapacious American healthcare. This is not the case, obviously. There are other countries with better models that have a much better outcomes at a reasonable cost.
On your travels, did you form a view of Obamacare?
Well, when I went to researching in America, I asked about Obamacare. Obviously, this was a few years ago, and they said, basically nobody understands Obamacare. It is so complicated that you'll never master it. I mean, there are still a lot of people, despite Obamacare, who are not insured. And one of the problems is the American Constitution, which really gets in the way of an integrated system, because you've got to get it past all these interest groups in Congress, and you've got to get the state level and the federal level. It's really difficult to get sensible legislation through.
And as I understand it, lots of middle-class people have had their insurance premiums skyrocket.
Absolutely, yes.
Under
That's
Obamacare.
right. Yeah.
Which seems to me to get to the heart of the problem with healthcare, is that if you're going to have a universal healthcare system, you're inevitably going to have to tax more heavily the productive sector of the economy.
No, certainly not.
Oh, is that right?
No. I mean, there are two basic systems where we could improve, get an ideal healthcare system, and one part of it is insurance, which they have which are compulsory. Everybody has to have insurance in Germany and Switzerland and the Netherlands. You have to have insurance. Okay, it's compulsory, and it is all equalised. So everybody, regardless of age or condition, effectively has an equalised insurance policy that they must pay. And the poor who can't afford it, they have it paid for them, and they have a basic policy. So that's the same all round. In the Netherlands and Switzerland, the variation is that you can choose your insurance company. So there's competition between insurance companies, and there's also competition between providers. And this level of competition is what drives down costs and improves performance. So those are the key things. But there's another system which I would certainly incorporate into an ideal healthcare system, and that's what happens in Singapore, where you are compulsorily required to save into a health savings account. And that builds up. Over the first 20 years of your working life, you're going to build up tens of thousands of pounds, even if you're on a moderate income, in your health savings account. And you can use that for basic healthcare. So you have entire power and choice of where and when you spend that money, and with whether it's a private hospital or a public hospital, you choose. So your consumer power is as great as that of people going to clothes shops or supermarkets. And that drives down costs enormously, because people care about their own money, which at the end of the day, if they've still got these savings at the end of their life, is they can take some out when it's above a certain level, or they can leave it to their inheritors.
So if you wanted liposuction or a penis enlargement or whatever, or breast enlargement, I don't know whether it's available on the Singapore health service, but that would be your choice. Whereas if you didn't spend it on frivolous things, you could have money for your children or whatever.
Exactly. So it makes you make a choice, and you don't think of it as a right. You think of it as, oh my God, do I really want this? How much does it cost?
Yeah.
And as a result of which, Singapore has got the cheapest healthcare system in the advanced world.
Are there any flaws with it that I should be aware of?
Well, we don't know. I mean, one of the problems with Singapore is it's not a member of the OECD, doesn't spend its money on the OECD, and so we don't have good comparative data on its outcomes. I visited a hospital in Singapore, and it was modern, attractive, very well organised, but the director of that hospital was quite frank with me. This is an IKEA service. It is not a luxury service. So, I mean, they wouldn't buy the latest, most expensive Da Vinci equipment for operating. He would use basic equipment, which you might take longer to recover from, but would cost less. So, I mean, obviously you can use your own money to buy a more luxury service, but he's providing what he called an IKEA service.
Isn't one of the problems about having effectively a state-rationed healthcare system, it's almost Stalinist, isn't it? Our National Health Service, sort of 1945 business model, which you'd never adopt today if you were going to start it from new, would you? One of the problems is that suddenly I become liable for the lifestyle choices of somebody else. So a fat person who's obviously going to need a bariatric ambulance and a bariatric surgeon to cut through all those layers of fat in order to reach his heart, to give him heart surgery to cope with the result of his excess fat consumption. Inevitably, people are going to feel that they're being forced to pay for something that is not in their interest to pay for. There's no way around that, is there? I mean, if you
have your own health savings account, you bear the cost of your own lifestyle, your own choices.
That's exactly what I mean. But there is no other way of avoiding that problem with a national healthcare system.
Or with an insurance system, you can't avoid that. That's why I would add the health savings. You need to have the insurance as well for catastrophic situations. So if you're going to be in hospital with a certain condition for 10 weeks, that would bankrupt anybody.
Yes.
Or most people. So you need to have what you call catastrophic insurance to cover you against that kind of eventuality.
And the catastrophic insurance would be on the principle that most of us are not going to need it, but if, God forbid, it does happen to us, we're going to be cushioned by the system, which adds that layer of justice, if you like, or fairness, just to acts of God almost.
Yes.
But otherwise,
where you draw the line between regular care that you have a health savings account for, and where you have insurance is a moot point. I mean, it could be at the GP level, it could be for basic elective operations where you choose to have something done, or it could, where you draw the line is up for grabs.
How easy would it be for us to reshape the NHS on that model? I mean, how radical would one have to be to do all this? I
think it would probably be done in a gradual way, as a guess. We do know it can be done because it's been done in the Netherlands. The Netherlands used to have a system that was quite similar to ours, and they have moved towards an insurance system with choice of insurers. So that it took them a long time. It took them 30 years to make that change. But they had an influential government report which was greeted with horror when it said we ought to have more private competition in healthcare. It's very inefficient, there's lots of rationing, similar sort of problems that we have in the UK. And people rubbished it and were angry with it, but gradually people came to accept it. It became a subject which people discussed, and over a period of years they have moved towards, they're now competing insurers, people can choose their insurer, and it is all compulsory and equalised.
Can you remember the name of that?
It's in the Welfare of Nations. I can't remember the name of the man who wrote the report.
But this person deserves a statue in whatever the main square in the Hague is.
Yeah, there are a number of people like that.
Yeah, well, that does give me hope. What doesn't give me hope, I'm afraid, is I know you said Owen Paterson was the first MP to speak out about this. I've got to go and debate this subject at Durham University against two MPs. And I just know the two MPs are going to come up with a line about how the NHS was provided to provide healthcare free at the point of use, and it's a great ideal, and blah, blah, blah. God bless the NHS. And I'm going to be powerless against their bullshit.
Yeah, the data is entirely on your side. Professor Sikora did an analysis of the cancer death. There were different rates of cancer deaths some years ago, and he calculated that 10,000 people a year in Britain die prematurely and unnecessarily because we are so far below the average standard of cancer care in Europe. The average, not the best, the average. So you've got to count loving the NHS in order to gain votes against 10,000 people a year dying from cancer alone who need not have died. I think it is morally disgraceful when these statistics are available to claim that the NHS is something to be admired, and a system that kills people, which you know kills people. To say it is a good thing is crass and insulting to the intelligence of the audience.
I love your rage, James, because I think we should talk about that in the next section of the show. You said the data's on my side. Yeah, isn't that the case with almost every right-wing argument? The data is on our side, always has been. Historical facts are on our side. What I want to talk to you about in the last bit is the toughness of being like you and me are, being an outsider, and how we're going to win over the other side. You're listening to James Delingpole on the Delingpole podcast, brought to you by Breitbart and Podcast One, with my very special guest, James Bartholomew.
Hi guys, it's Jack Vanek from the Lady Gang. If you like mimosas and having a bunch of girl talk, why are you not listening to the Lady Gang? We are your one-stop shop for all your lady talk. New episodes are out every Tuesday on iTunes or podcastone.com.
Stay tuned for 60-second AP News headlines.
AP Update, I'm Diane Kepley. Questions are swirling in Washington about the contacts between Trump administration officials and the Russians.
Was General Flynn directed or authorized to do what he did? What was the extent of his conversations and contacts with Russia? Who else from the Trump administration, transition, or campaign had contact with the Russians?
Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and others are calling for an independent investigation to get the answers to those questions. There is pushback from President Trump. This morning, he's lashing out at the news media, saying the fake news media is going crazy with what he calls their conspiracy theories and blind hatred. He adds in his tweet, the Russian connection nonsense is an attempt to cover up mistakes made in Hillary Clinton's losing campaign. Meantime, in Moscow, a Kremlin spokesman is denying reports about intercepted phone calls between intelligence officials and members of the Trump presidential campaign. AP Update.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Hello, welcome back to Delingpole, the show presented by me, James Delingpole, brought to you by Breitbart and Podcast One, with my very special guest, James Bartholomew. Now, James and I have been hanging out at various right-wing events over the last few years, one of which we met at the premiere of Brexit the movie, in which we both starred. That was a glorious moment, wasn't it, James, being a film star?
It was glorious, the red carpet, champagne on the balcony above Leicester Square, looking down at the crowd. Yes, fantastic.
Yeah, and we were on the right side of history. Did you believe it was going to be possible? But when that film came out, I was looking around at my fellow immensely sound right-wing friends, and Nigel Farage was there, and Charles Moore, and all sorts of Heffer, all the kind of really sound right-wing columnists, and not many of the unsound ones. So we were all there together, and I thought to myself, if a bomb goes off in this room, the soundest people in Britain will all be dead, and it will be game over. I mean, we really were like the rebels fighting the Death Star, weren't we?
It was terrifically exciting, and there was one of the reasons which gave you hope was that the enthusiasm and excitement of the crowd was so intense, and one could not imagine a Remain event generating that amount of excitement and enthusiasm.
No. And also, I was reminded of a conversation I had with, who's the guy in charge of the University of Buckingham?
Well, it was Terence Keeley.
I think it was Terence Keeley. I was at some libertarian party with Linda Whetstone and people like that, and he said that libertarian types tend to be much nicer than lefties because lefties put all they feel that their left-wing politics are enough to justify their bad behaviour, so they feel under no compulsion to behave well in their private life, whereas libertarians and conservatives are told so often about what awful people they are, that they go the extra mile to be nice and amusing. Do you think that's true?
No, not at all.
I think we're a bunch of bastards.
I think that I sometimes am embarrassed by my fellow travellers.
Oh no!
Without naming any names. Some of them I think not you, James, no. But some of them I think, my goodness, why can't we have nice people on our side? And I thought I feel the exact opposite of what you described.
Really?
I thought, what nice people, pity they're completely bonkers and wrong about every important issue.
It's certainly true that there are very few people who are right about everything. I mean, I can think of it was me. But yeah, no, I was reading a columnist in the Telegraph today who's immensely sound economically, and I thought he was just talking absolute bollocks about whatever he was talking about. So almost nobody is consistent. But can I say I welcome a tiny glimmer of disagreement on this show, because normally it's the show of consensualness and sensuality. What's the substantive of that? I'm not sure. And loveliness, but. So where again, this one you said you were going to say something that was going to shock me about how to win the political argument.
I wasn't going to shock you, I was just going to disagree with you.
Oh yeah.
I think the way to win the political argument is the same way that I think the most important way in which we won the Brexit, or one of the important ways we won the Brexit vote, which was being reasonable and sensible and as nice as we can be.
Oh, for God's sake.
I'm sorry, James. I knew you weren't going to like this.
No. I think there's room for all of us. I had this talk about with my friend, you must know him as well, Christopher Booker. And Christopher Booker have spent large chunks of our lives fighting the climate wars. And Booker says, look, you need all kinds of people in this war. You need the sceptical scientists providing the science, but providing pretty measured, dry scientific data. And then you've got the attack dogs, people like me, who are there to just kind of grab people's attention and show the argument in a forceful way. You, I would say, are much nicer in print than I am. And you do come up with some top phrases. Yeah, we've got to mention this on the show. You are the guy who invented one of the greatest phrases in the political lexicon, virtue signalling. You must be so proud of that. I am. I'm immensely proud. Just tell us what virtue signalling is.
Virtue signalling is when somebody thinks they can say something and indicate to other people that they are virtuous, righteous, decent people, without actually ever doing anything at all. So, for example, if you say, I hate the Daily Mail, you're indicating that you are open-minded, liberal, decent, internationalist, non-racist, a whole lot of things about yourself. And the more you say you hate the Mail, the more virulently and angrily you say you hate the Daily Mail, the more you establish your credentials as a good person. But you have not, in the process, done anything actually good. And I'm old-fashioned and old enough to remember a time when at least Christians were told that you should not boast about your virtue at all in the first place, and when virtue consisted entirely of actually doing things.
Yeah.
And sacrifice. I mean, to do something that's virtuous that involves no sacrifice is not true virtue. Real virtue comes from when you do something which you really is not enjoyable to you.
Yeah, absolutely right. Let's think of a few more examples of virtue signalling. I suppose I hate Nigel Farage. That would be a virtue
absolutely.
signaling.
Yeah.
I love the NHS. I've noticed that the worst people on Twitter have on their what are their photographs called, their avatar or their twit pic. They either have a picture of their children, or a picture of themselves with their children, or some text which describes how they're a father, son, brother, loving husband of ... Or they have a banner that says Heart NHS, or it has some badge which displays some kind of victimhood, like Spartacus. I think Spartacus is a sort of mental health thing, or people with health problems who advertise those. They're absolutely ghastly. And you think they'd be nice. You think somehow the kind of the bruising effects of experience and suffering would somehow turn them to be benign people. But what I find it does is it just increases their hatred. But I got sidetracked there. Other examples of virtue signalling.
Well, I first became... I've been conscious of the concept of this for many years, decades. And what used to annoy me, and as I'm sure that you have had the same experiences, when people think to them, you can understand, you can learn through talking to them, that they think that by voting Labour or voting for a left-wing party, they have established that they are good people. And that if you do not vote Labour, it is established that you are a bad person. And they the arrogance and complacency and self-regard of these people is irritating. Especially when they haven't... I know people who are maybe dull, elderly person, somebody, for example, a woman I know who's looked after her husband who was unwell for 6 or 7 years, more or less as a nurse for all that period of time. She could have dumped him in a nursing home, but she looked after him herself. And this could not have been fun. It must have been a real, work for her. But she did it because she felt she had a duty to do so. That, in my book, is virtue. And this cheap way in which people think they can just strike an attitude or have an attitude and think that they are virtuous is A, absurd, and B, irritating.
Yes. I think it's one of the dimensions to my politics that I hadn't really thought about in my younger days. I used to think of myself as a libertarian, but I realised that libertarianism is not in itself enough. You have to have some of those more conservative virtues, like the sense of duty that you mentioned, and this kind of reverence for tradition, rather than this year zero thing that the left loves. But you're absolutely right that knowing the right way to behave because it is the custom and because your parents have taught you how to do it is an important part.
The use of the word in the Welfare of Nations, I track the use of the word. I think it's either duty or honour, and how the use of that word has diminished over the years. It's gone down. The tracking use of words is quite an interesting insight into changes in society.
Yes, absolutely.
And now we have the Oriel series of advertisements, because I'm worth it. It is such a narcissistic, self-centred approach to life.
Where do you think it all went wrong? There's that fantastic book by A.J.P. Taylor. There's a chapter, actually, I was talking to this about. Dominic Frisby mentions it in his book. And A.J.P. Taylor describes how Britain was before the outbreak of the First World War, and describes how little the government impinged on the lives of the average British subject. And of course, things changed dramatically. The size of the state grew in the First World War and in the Second. Is that it? The war?
That is the opening. Those are the opening words. The paragraphs you're referring to are the opening words of his section of the Oxford History, and they're quoted in full in the Welfare of Nations. And they do describe how an Englishman could go anywhere he liked without having to have any documents or anything at all. And similarly, a foreigner could live in England at the same time with only contact with the postman and the police would be the only contact with government. And A.J.P. Taylor argues that this is because of the wars. And undoubtedly the wars did have a big effect, both directly and increasing the belief that government could fix everything. Because we won those wars, and we came away thinking, governments can win wars, they can probably win the war on poverty.
Yeah.
And indeed, Lyndon Johnson, very much felt, we had, best post-war, we've just won a war, we can make the great society. All we have to do is to dish out money. Simples.
Yeah.
And it's not simples. Welfare, I mean, in a way, I think we should think of welfare states as being in their earliest, almost embryonic phase, because they've only existed for the last 100 years or so. So if we look back, the future of civilization hopefully will go on for thousands or tens of thousands of years. And we will go through lots of ups and downs in histories of our welfare states. And we will learn a lot. We will think of what we've been through in the last 100 years as the first blunderings of welfare states around the world.
Do you think that it was the same for America? I was thinking one of the great pernicious myths about the Great Depression, that it was cured by FDR, and that somehow the World War II was the solution for it. Well, I'm not sure that FDR was. I think he'd been on the Great Depression, wouldn't he?
Probably. I won't claim to be expert on this area, but certainly in Britain, the welfare, because people imagine welfare benefits were created by the Attlee government. They were not. They existed from 1919, and they were particularly badly designed in the 30s. And companies could keep sort of part-time labour available to them by doing 1 day on, 1 day off with labour. It was called OXO. And it was well known that it was a really bad system. And Beveridge was called in partly to change the system, which was so known to be full of abuse. Churchill referred to how it was abused.
You're not saying, surely, that businesses took advantage of government regulation for their own ends?
Absolutely. And growth was taking place during the 1930s. It just wasn't taking place employment was all over the place.
Yeah, isn't one of the fundamental misconceptions about welfare is that somehow poor people are not informed and rational? I'm thinking, for example, of if you make special payments for single mothers, you will get an increase in single mothers. And the left seems not to understand that they sort of imagine that poor women, women of childbearing age, are not going to be prey to the incentivisation of this kind of government regulation. They just think this is an outrageous view of human behaviour.
Yes, there's a middle-class guilt which doesn't allow the possibility that poor people could be influenced by money. Yes. They only find themselves in circumstances and would have been in those circumstances regardless of incentives one way or another. Yeah. It is patronising and unimaginative.
I suppose it goes back to the deserving poor and Mrs. Jellyby in Dickens dumping her generosity on pickaninnies from abroad.
One of the things that James Naughton used to say on the Today programme on BBC Radio 4 was he said, you don't want to go back to the Victorian days of the undeserving poor, do you? And say this with absolute horror. And I longed for him to have the chance to answer him on this question and say, actually, all welfare systems have always had a sense of the undeserving poor. They expect, even in the most generous days of the British welfare state, it was legally required that an unemployed person should seek work. It wasn't very well enforced. In fact, it was very badly enforced. But in theory, that requirement has always been there.
James Bartholomew, thank you very much for another really interesting show. Just tell us what your books are called again and where people can get them.
They're called The Welfare State We're In, and which is the older book about the British welfare state, and The Welfare of Nations, which compares countries around the world from America through to New Zealand, Singapore, and so on. And so both of them are being published by Biteback in the UK, and The Welfare of Nations has just been published by the Cato Institute in the United States.
Oh, one more question. Has anyone come up with any country got a welfare system that actually you and I would like, that works?
I think it does vary from one area of welfare to another, because we haven't talked about care for the elderly and all sorts of systems, all different areas of the welfare state. But as a generality, I would say that the Swiss and the Singaporean systems have the best organised welfare states.
And the worst?
I'd say competition between Britain and America.
Doesn't that make you so proud? Thank you. You were listening to James Bartholomew on the Delingpole podcast, brought to you by Podcast One and Breitbart. Thank you so much for listening, lovely listener. Till next week. Bye.